At 58, Olivia had believed her life had reached a peaceful conclusion. After retiring from nursing, her days were filled with the tranquility of rural life, gardening, reading old novels, and walking through the quiet woods behind her home. Her husband, Edward, had passed away 3 years earlier, and while the grief lingered, she had grown accustomed to the silence. The phone call from Liam came unexpectedly. He was Edward's son from his previous marriage, a young man Olivia had always been kind to, but they had never been particularly close. Liam, now 25, had just finished law school and was struggling to find stable work. He was losing his apartment and had no one else to turn to. "Olivia, I'm in a bit of a bind." His voice was hesitant over the phone. "Do you think I could stay with you for a while? Just until I get back on my feet." She hadn't seen Liam in over a year, but she remembered him as a quiet and somewhat awkward teenager. "Of course," she had said, after a brief pause. "You can stay as long as you need." When Liam arrived, Olivia was surprised by how much he had changed. The boy she remembered was now a confident young man with broad shoulders, a sculpted jawline, and a smattering of stubble that made him look older than his years. He stepped out of his car in jeans and a fitted t-shirt, which clung to his well-defined frame. Olivia felt a strange flutter in her chest, which she quickly pushed aside, telling herself it was simply surprise at how much he had grown. "Thank you for letting me stay," Liam said, pulling her into a quick hug. His touch was warm, his voice deeper than she remembered. Olivia led him inside, feeling a bit off balance. "The guest room's ready." "I hope you'll be comfortable," she said, trying to shake the odd feeling. The first week passed without much incident. Liam spent most of his time job hunting or out for long runs, while Olivia maintained her usual routine. She tried to keep her distance, giving him the space she thought he needed. However, she couldn't ignore the small, but unsettling awareness of his presence. He was everywhere, in the kitchen, lounging on the couch in the evening, or walking past her room with a towel around his waist after a shower. His casual, youthful energy contrasted starkly with the quiet, structured life she had built for herself. One evening, Olivia was in the kitchen making dinner when Liam entered, fresh from a shower. His damp hair curled slightly at the ends, and his t-shirt clung to his chest, revealing every curve of his muscles. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she chopped vegetables. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice soft but with an underlying confidence. Olivia shook her head quickly, avoiding his gaze. "No, I've got it under control." But he didn't move away. Instead, he stood closer, reaching past her to grab a glass of water, his arm brushing lightly against hers. The warmth of his skin sent a small jolt through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. She froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, but forced herself to continue chopping as if nothing had happened. Liam lingered in the kitchen, watching her with a quiet intensity that made Olivia feel suddenly exposed. She hadn't felt so self-conscious in a long time, but there was no denying the tension that seemed to settle between them. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Olivia replayed the moment in her head. Was it just her imagination? She was widowed, lonely, and hadn't been close to anyone in years. It was only natural that she might feel something out of place. But why Liam? Why now? She dismissed the thought as irrational, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. There was something in the way he looked at her that stirred emotions she hadn't felt in a long time, emotions she thought were long buried. It was 2 weeks after Liam had moved in when things between them started to shift noticeably. Olivia had gone to bed early that evening, the house enveloped in a peaceful quiet. It was around midnight when she awoke to the soft creak of her bedroom door opening. Her heart quickened as she turned over and saw Liam standing in the doorway. He was silhouetted by the light from the hallway, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. For a moment, She wondered if she was still dreaming. "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. "Is something wrong?" He stepped into the room, his face difficult to read in the darkness. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted softly, walking slowly toward her bed. His voice was different, quieter, more vulnerable than the confident tone he usually carried. Olivia sat up, pulling the blanket around herself. "What's on your mind?" Liam hesitated for a moment before sitting on the edge of the bed, his body sinking into the mattress beside her. "I don't know," he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Everything just feels unsettled." Without thinking, Olivia reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. It was a small gesture, something she had done countless times in her nursing career, but this time it felt different. The warmth of his skin under her fingers sent an unfamiliar thrill through her, one she couldn't ignore. "You're going to be all right," she said softly, her hand lingering longer than necessary. "It's just a rough patch." Liam turned to look at her, his eyes locking onto hers. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. There was an intensity in his gaze that made Olivia's heart race. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken tension. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Liam reached up and placed his hand over hers. The touch was gentle but firm, his fingers curling around hers in a way that made it clear this was not just a moment of comfort. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her, this was more than what it seemed. "Liam," she whispered, her voice shaky, but she didn't pull away. Her rational mind screamed at her to stop, to pull back and set boundaries, but her body betrayed her, leaning slightly toward him instead. Liam moved closer, his hand sliding up her arm in a slow, deliberate motion that sent shivers down her spine. He leaned in, his breath warm against her cheek as he whispered, "I can't stop thinking about you, Olivia." The words were like a spark, igniting something deep within her that she had long since buried. Her heart pounded in her chest as he closed the distance between them, his lips brushing softly against hers. The kiss was tentative at first, testing the waters, but when Olivia didn't pull away, it deepened, becoming more urgent, more insistent. She found herself responding, her hands moving up to his shoulders as she kissed him back, her body awakening in ways she hadn't felt in years. His hands slid around her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other's. Olivia's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This was wrong, so wrong, and yet, in that moment, it felt impossibly right. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," Liam replied, his voice soft but firm. I needed you to know how I feel." The air between them was thick, charged with an intensity Olivia hadn't felt in years. After the kiss, they stayed still for a moment, their breaths heavy, their bodies close, but the silence was filled with unspoken desires. Olivia could feel Liam's pulse racing just as fast as her own. Her rational mind still told her this was wrong, but her body refused to listen. Liam's eyes searched hers, and without a word, he moved closer again, more deliberate this time. His hand slid around the back of her neck, fingers tangling gently in her hair as he pulled her toward him. Olivia felt herself leaning in, drawn to him by something she couldn't control. When their lips met again, it wasn't tentative like before. This time, the kiss was filled with urgency, a hunger they had both been holding back for too long. Olivia's hands found their way to Liam's chest, feeling the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. His body was firm and solid under her touch, and she could feel the strength in him, the raw physicality of a much younger man. As her fingers traced the lines of his muscles, Liam deepened the kiss, his tongue gently parting her lips. She responded without hesitation, letting herself be swept away by the moment. Liam's hands moved from her neck down her sides, his touch soft but deliberate, as though he was exploring every inch of her body with care. He slid his fingers down her back, tracing the curve of her spine before pulling her closer, eliminating the small distance that remained between them. Olivia gasped softly into his mouth as the heat between them intensified. She could feel the hard lines of his body pressed against her, the electricity between them almost unbearable. "Liam," she whispered breathlessly, breaking the kiss for a moment, but she didn't move away. Instead, she found herself running her hands up and down his arms, feeling the strength in them, the warmth of his skin. She could sense the restraint in him, how he was holding himself back, afraid to push too far too fast. But Olivia didn't want him to stop. She didn't want to think anymore. Liam's eyes met hers again, filled with desire but also uncertainty. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice hoarse, "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to do anything you don't want." For a second, Olivia's mind flashed back to her life before this moment, to the quiet evenings alone, the loneliness that had settled into her bones after Edward had passed. But here, with Liam, that loneliness was nowhere to be found. She felt alive again, her senses heightened, her body awakened in ways she hadn't thought possible. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his ear, her breath warm against his skin. "I don't want you to stop," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and desire. "I need this, Liam." That was all it took. Liam's restraint melted away, and in one swift motion, he scooped her into his arms, pulling her onto his lap. Olivia's nightgown shifted as she straddled him, the fabric gathering at her thighs. She could feel the heat of his body through his clothes, and when his hands slid under the hem of her gown, caressing the soft skin of her legs, a shiver ran through her entire body. He kissed her again, his hands exploring her more boldly now, moving up her thighs, over her hips, and around her waist. Every touch sent a surge of heat through Olivia, awakening desires she had long buried. She couldn't stop herself from moaning softly into his mouth as his fingers traced the curve of her lower back. Olivia's own hands became more daring as well. She tugged at the hem of his shirt, pulling it up over his head in one fluid motion. Her breath caught at the side of his bare chest, the hard lines of his muscles, the smooth skin. She ran her hands over him, savoring the feel of his body under her fingers. It had been so long since she had touched anyone like this, and the sensation was intoxicating. Liam's hands slid up her body, tracing the sides of her waist before coming to rest just beneath her breasts. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as though he was taking his time to memorize every inch of her. Olivia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her body aching for more. "Liam," she whispered again, her voice thick with desire. "Don't stop." He didn't need any more encouragement. His hands moved higher, brushing over the soft fabric of her nightgown until he reached the thin straps resting on her shoulders. Slowly, he slid them down, bearing her skin to him inch by inch. Olivia's breath hitched as the fabric slipped down her chest, exposing her to him completely. For a moment, Liam paused, his eyes dark with desire as he took in the sight of her. Olivia's skin flushed under his gaze, a mix of vulnerability and excitement washing over her. She had never felt this way before, so exposed, so desired. "You're beautiful," Liam murmured, his voice filled with awe. He leaned forward, pressing soft kisses to her collarbone, his lips trailing down to her chest. Olivia's head fell back, her body arching into him as he worshipped her with his mouth, his hands, every part of him. The tension between them built to a crescendo as their bodies moved together, the room filled with the sound of their heavy breaths, soft moans, and the rustle of fabric as they explored each other. Every kiss, every touch, was filled with a need they could no longer deny. When the moment finally came, it was electric. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, lost in each other. It was messy, it was complicated, but it was real. And in that moment, Olivia didn't care about the consequences. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she felt alive, truly alive. As they lay together afterward, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Olivia rested her head on Liam's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She could feel his fingers gently stroking her back, a tender gesture that sent warmth flooding through her. "Olivia," he whispered after a long silence, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What happens now?" Olivia closed her eyes, letting out a soft sigh. She didn't have an answer for him, not yet. What they had done couldn't be undone, and the path ahead was unclear. But for now, in this moment, she didn't want to think about the future. "We'll figure it out," she murmured, her hand resting gently on his chest. "One step at a time." And with that, they fell into a quiet understanding, wrapped in the warmth of each other's embrace, both knowing that their lives had been irreversibly changed.